He didn't see the stars. That was the first thought that crossed my mind as I stood in the doorway of our team room and watched 12 grown men quietly packing their gear into sea bags like they were being transferred to a desk job in Nebraska. No yelling, no cursing, just the low scrape of metal lockers and the dull snap of zippers closing on something they'd spent decades earning. "Don't unpack," I said. Every head turned. They thought I meant it as comfort. They didn't know yet that I meant it as a directive. An hour earlier, I had been seated in a secure conference room on the 3rd floor of the Naval Special Warfare Compound in Virginia Beach, listening to a joint security briefing about an upcoming deployment to the Horn of Africa. It was late October gray outside, the kind of damp coastal cold that settles into your bones. I'd left my cover in the car, no stars on my shoulders, no visible rank beyond what anyone would assume for a senior officer attending an oversight meeting. Halfway through the briefing, my phone buzzed once on silent. I ignored it. When we broke for 10 minutes, I stepped into the hallway and checked the message. It was from Chief Ramirez. "Ma'am, we've been pulled from Viper 7. Orders just came down." I stood there a moment rereading the words. Viper 7 was not just another rotation. It was a targeted mission set our team had been preparing for since early summer. Months of specialized training, language refreshers, environmental conditioning. 2 of my men had postponed retirement to see it through. I didn't rush back downstairs. I didn't call anyone. I simply returned to the conference table and finished the briefing. When it adjourned, I walked to the team room. That's when I saw it, the quiet dismantling of something earned. Petty Officer Collins had his framed photo of his granddaughter tucked under his arm. Lieutenant Harris was stripping Velcro patches off his ruck with slow, deliberate movements. Chief Ramirez stood by the whiteboard, jaw, tight eyes fixed on nothing. What happened, I asked, though I already knew. Ramirez stepped forward. "Orders from the CO, ma'am. We're off Viper 7. Slot reassigned." "To who?" He hesitated just long enough to confirm my suspicion. "Lieutenant Commander Bryce, just transferred in from D.C. The Golden Boy." Bryce had arrived 3 weeks earlier with a polished smile and a resume heavy on policy fellowships and light on field command. His father was a retired 3-star with friends still seated comfortably in Washington. He was bright, well-spoken, and completely untested in the kind of terrain Viper 7 required. "Reason I asked?" Ramirez's voice hardened. "Word is, the new guy has better connections." There it was. I nodded once slowly, as if absorbing routine information. Then I said, "Don't unpack." Silence settled across the room. Harris frowned. "Ma'am?" "Leave everything as it is." I turned and walked out before anyone could ask more. I found Commander Blake, our commanding officer, in his office overlooking the parking lot. He was standing behind his desk, tie-loosened sleeves rolled up like he'd just finished making a difficult but necessary call. "Ma'am," he said, surprised but composed, "I was meaning to speak with you." I replied evenly. He gestured toward the chair. "Please." I remained standing. "Viper 7 required a strategic adjustment," he began. "We need someone who can navigate the diplomatic landscape. Bryce has strong interagency relationships." "My team has 6 combined deployments to that region," I said. 2 speak Somali. 1 has operated specifically in the corridor flagged in this morning's intel. Blake sighed, as if I were discussing a scheduling conflict rather than a mission. "This came from higher up," he said carefully. "It's about optics, coordination, long-term positioning." "Optics," one repeated. He met my eyes. "You know how this works." Oh, I knew exactly how it worked. What he didn't know was how it also worked beyond his line of sight. "Understood," I said. He seemed relieved by my calm. "I value your professionalism," he added. "Your team will get another opportunity." I gave a small nod and left. Back in my office, I closed the door and sat down for the first time that afternoon. The walls were lined with framed citations and commendations, none of which displayed the full story of how they'd been earned. I kept my uniform simple most days. I preferred it that way. On my desk sat a thin folder stamped with the tasking authority insignia. I opened it. Viper 7 required final operational endorsement before deployment. That endorsement did not come from Blake. It did not come from Bryce. It came from me. Rear Admiral Evelyn Morgan, Naval Special Warfare Oversight Command. I ran my thumb lightly over the small silver stars on the folder's embossed seal. I rarely wore them inside this building. Authority, I had learned, carried more weight when it walked quietly. My phone rang. It was Lieutenant Commander Bryce. "Ma'am," he said brightly, "just wanted to introduce myself formally. Looks like I'll be taking Viper 7. "Congratulations," I replied. "I understand your team has done preliminary prep. I'll review their notes." "They've done more than prep," I said. "They've committed." A pause. "Well, I intend to make them proud." "I'm sure you do." We ended the call politely. Outside my window, I could see my men loading gear back into lockers, not fully unpacked, not fully resigned. I thought about my father, a mechanic in Dayton who worked 40 years without a promotion, but never once complained. He used to tell me titles don't make the work honest. The work makes the title honest. I picked up my pen. I did not sign the endorsement. Instead, I drafted a formal request for additional risk assessment, citing updated intelligence discrepancies that had been briefly mentioned and quickly dismissed in that morning's briefing. It was legitimate, it was procedural, and it required my signature. By the time the sun set over the Atlantic, an automated notice had gone out: Viper 7 pending review. Deployment delayed. Commander Blake would receive it within minutes. I leaned back in my chair and allowed myself one steady breath. He didn't see the stars. Commander Blake called me at 19:07 hours. I remember the exact time because I was standing in my kitchen in Norfolk rinsing a coffee mug, listening to the local news hum softly in the background. A story about property taxes in Chesapeake. A segment about a church fundraiser. Ordinary American life. The kind of life most of my men returned to between deployments. My phone vibrated on the counter. Admiral Morgan Blake said the moment I answered. He hadn't called me that before. "Yes, Commander." "There's a hold on Viper 7. "I'm aware." "Tasking Authority requested additional risk review." "That's correct." A pause. I could hear the faint echo of his office through the line, the hum of fluorescent lights, the muted shuffle of papers. "You could have mentioned your concerns earlier," he said carefully. "I did," I replied, "in the briefing." Another pause. "You didn't disclose that you were the endorsing authority." "I wasn't asked." Silence again, this one heavier. "I'll need to brief Bryce," he said finally. "I would expect you to." We ended the call without hostility, but without warmth. I set my phone down and looked around my kitchen. Modest townhouse, 2 bedrooms, a small wooden table by the window. Nothing about my home suggested rank. I had bought it 12 years ago when I made flag against the advice of a colleague who insisted I should upgrade. My father would have laughed at the word. He worked 38 years at a transmission plant outside Dayton. Came home every night with grease under his fingernails and a thermos that smelled faintly of burnt coffee. He never wore stars on his shoulders, but he carried something steadier. After 9/11, when I told him I was applying to the Naval Academy, he didn't give a speech. He just nodded and said, "Then do it right." I was 28, older than most applicants. I had already earned a degree in mechanical engineering from Ohio State. I had already learned that walking into rooms full of younger men who assumed you were misplaced required a certain kind of patience. At Annapolis, I learned to keep my voice level, to let my work speak, to run farther than anyone expected, to study harder than anyone assumed I would. I did not pursue the SEAL pipeline. I pursued oversight, logistics, intelligence, operational strategy, the connective tissue that kept missions from unraveling. It was less glamorous. It was also where mistakes cost lives. Over the years, I deployed repeatedly in advisory roles. Afghanistan, Djibouti, Bahrain. I learned the smell of jet fuel at dawn, the sound of distant artillery, the particular way a seasoned operator checks his team before stepping into the dark. I also learned something else. Connections can open doors, they cannot close body bags. By 2018, I had made Rear Admiral and been assigned to Naval Special Warfare Oversight Command. It was a quiet position, less ceremony, more responsibility. My job was not to command teams in the field, it was to ensure the right teams were sent for the right reasons. Which is why Viper 7 mattered. The next morning I arrived at the compound before sunrise. The air carried that Atlantic chill that settles into your collar. Inside, the hallways smelled faintly of floor wax and coffee. Chief Ramirez was already in the team room. "Ma'am," he said, standing straighter than necessary, "we heard about the delay." "It's under review," I said evenly. His eyes searched my face. Is that good or bad? It's responsible. He nodded once. Harris stepped forward. With respect, Ma'am Bryce's team hasn't trained for that terrain. I'm aware. Collins shifted his weight. You think they'll reinstate us? I met each of their eyes in turn, men in their 40s and 50s, some with grown children, some with knees that ached in cold weather but would never admit it. I think I said carefully that we will proceed when it is safe and justified. That was all I would give them. Later that morning I attended a secondary review session. Bryce was there, crisp uniform, confident expression. Admiral, he said, respectful but strained. Lieutenant Commander. He gestured toward the updated intel packet. We believe the risk assessment is overly cautious. The window of opportunity is narrowing. Opportunity for what I asked. To establish regional credibility. There are more efficient ways to establish credibility than gambling with underprepared operators. His jaw tightened. With respect, my team is prepared. For this specific corridor. He hesitated just long enough. Preparation, I said calmly, is not a general condition. It is specific. Blake cleared his throat. The additional review will be completed within 72 hours. Good, I said. When the meeting adjourned, Bryce lingered. Admiral, he said more quietly, I understand you have reservations. I have responsibility. He studied me for a moment. My father believes this assignment will demonstrate readiness for greater command. I held his gaze. Your father is not the one deploying. That landed. For the first time I saw something beneath the polish, not arrogance exactly, pressure. I intend to prove myself, he said. Then prove yourself by listening. He left without replying. That afternoon I drove home past Little League fields and strip malls and retirees walking small dogs along the sidewalk. America at ease. The kind of normalcy my men defended without fanfare. In my living room, a small wooden box sat on the bookshelf. Inside were my father's tools, a wrench worn smooth at the handle. Earned, not given. I had not intervened out of pride. I had intervened because responsibility doesn't bend to optics. Somewhere in the building, Blake was beginning to understand that the delay had not been procedural inconvenience. It had been a boundary. He hadn't seen the stars. But he was starting to feel their weight. By the third day of the review, the building felt different. Not louder, not openly tense, just cautious. Word travels quickly in any command, especially when a deployment is paused at the endorsement level. No one said it outright, but everyone understood something unusual had happened. Viper 7 wasn't a minor operation. It had funding, political interest, and eyes on it from offices well above Commander Blake's. And now it was stalled. I arrived early again that morning and found Lieutenant Commander Bryce in the hallway outside the operations center studying a wall-mounted map of the Horn of Africa. He had a legal pad tucked under his arm sleeves, pressed posture straight. Admiral, he said as I approached. Lieutenant Commander. He gestured toward the map. I've been reviewing updated terrain reports. I think we can mitigate the concerns raised in your assessment. My assessment raised questions I corrected gently. Mitigation begins with clarity. He nodded. Yes, ma'am. There was something different in his tone. Less certainty, more effort. We stood side by side for a moment, looking at a region thousands of miles away, while the hum of the ventilation system filled the silence. You've never deployed to this corridor, I said. No, ma'am. You've deployed at all. He hesitated. Joint advisory in Qatar, 6 months. Operational. Strategic liaison. I absorbed that. Viper 7 isn't liaison work, I said quietly. I'm aware. Are you? He met my eyes then, and for the first time I saw not entitlement but strain. My father believes, he began carefully, that command readiness requires visible leadership. And what do you believe? He didn't answer immediately. I believe, he said finally, that I've been given an opportunity. Opportunity, I repeated. Or expectation. His jaw tightened slightly. That was the moment I understood him more clearly. Bryce wasn't malicious. He wasn't reckless for sport. He was carrying someone else's timeline, someone else's ambition. And he was trying to meet it before he had built the foundation for it. That is a dangerous place to stand. Later that morning, the updated intelligence report came in. Satellite confirmation suggested movement in the target corridor inconsistent with prior assessments. what had been labeled a low-density insurgent pocket, now showed signs of coordinated activity vehicles, temporary encampments, irregular communications bursts. The kind of discrepancy that gets people killed. I called an immediate review. Commander Blake arrived first, face drawn. "Is it verified?" he asked. "Cross-referenced twice," I said. "Signal intercept aligns." Bryce entered moments later, file in hand. "This doesn't invalidate the mission," he said quickly. "It complicates it." "It transforms it," I corrected. Blake rubbed his forehead. "If we proceed under original parameters, we would be deploying under outdated assumptions," I said. Bryce leaned forward. "Then we adjust the parameters." "With what team?" I asked evenly. Silence. His team had trained for diplomatic engagement and limited field advisory. They had not conducted the type of environmental rehearsal my SEAL unit had completed over the past 4 months. Bryce looked at the updated satellite image again, slower this time. "I wasn't briefed on this variance before accepting the assignment," he said. "That I replied is precisely the point." Blake exhaled. "We need to consider reinstating Morgan's team." There it was. Not triumphant, not dramatic, just practical. Bryce's shoulders stiffened slightly, not in anger, but in realization. "If that's the recommendation," he said carefully, "I support it." That surprised Blake. It did not surprise me. Later, I asked Bryce to walk with me. We stepped outside into the cold afternoon air. The Atlantic wind carried the faint scent of salt and diesel. A few sailors crossed the lot toward their cars, laughing about something unrelated to missions or oversight or reputations. "Your father called Blake," I said calmly. Bryce stopped walking. "He shouldn't have," he said quietly. "But he did." He nodded once. "And you didn't stop him?" Another pause. "No, ma'am." I looked out toward the water. "Ambition isn't wrong," I said, "but borrowed authority is unstable. It collapses under pressure." He swallowed. "I thought I could grow into it." "Growth requires weight you can carry." He was silent for several seconds. "I don't want to cost anyone their life," he said finally. "That's the first correct thing you've said since you arrived." He almost smiled at that. "I'm not your enemy," I continued, "but I will not endorse a mission to protect someone's resume." He nodded slowly. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," I said, "we adjust the mission, with the right team, and you observe." Observe? Learn what readiness actually looks like. We walked back inside. That evening, the recommendation was formalized. Viper 7 would proceed under revised parameters, led by my SEAL unit with Bryce attached in supervisory capacity. Commander Blake signed the internal adjustment memo. I signed the operational endorsement. This time I wore my stars. Not to intimidate. Not to prove a point. But because clarity matters. In the team room, Ramirez looked up as I entered. "Ma'am." "Prepare for deployment," I said. A slow grin spread across his face. Collins clapped Harris on the shoulder. No cheers, no theatrics, just the steady hum of men returning to purpose. Bryce stood in the doorway watching. He had seen the satellite images. He had heard the silence in the review room. He had felt the shift. And now finally he saw the stars. The night before deployment, I stayed later than anyone else. The compound had gone quiet in that particular way military buildings do, after 2,100 hours. Fluorescent lights dimmed in empty corridors, cleaning crews moving methodically, the distant echo of boots against polished floors. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the flag against its halyard. On my desk sat the final mission packet for Viper 7. Revised parameters. Updated intelligence overlays, adjusted extraction contingencies, medical evacuation staging clarified, air support windows recoordinated. All the small, unremarkable details that determine whether a team comes home intact. At the bottom of the endorsement page, my name was printed in clean black letters. Rear Admiral Evelyn Morgan, Naval Special Warfare Oversight Command. The line beneath waited for my signature. I didn't rush it. For Americans who grew up watching Walter Cronkite announce casualties at dinner time, who remember Vietnam letters folded into trembling hands, authority means something different. It is not abstract. It carries weight. When I signed that line, I wasn't approving a strategy. I was accepting accountability. The next morning, the team assembled before dawn. The sky over Virginia Beach was still black, the air sharp enough to sting. Engines idled near the runway. Gear was loaded with the quiet efficiency of men who have done this too many times to dramatize it. Ramirez approached me, helmet tucked under his arm. All squared away, ma'am. Medical. Confirmed. Comms. Redundant. Extraction. 2 options, both viable. I nodded once. Bryce stood several feet behind him, watching, absorbing. He had removed the crisp stiffness from his posture. His sleeves were rolled not for show, but because he had spent the last 48 hours in planning rooms learning what he had not known. You'll remain at forward coordination, I told him. You observe, you document, you ask questions after. Yes, ma'am. There was no resentment in his voice. Only focus. As the aircraft doors closed and the engines began to rise in pitch, I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. Not fear, exactly. Responsibility. Blake stepped beside me on the tarmac. You were right, he said quietly, eyes fixed on the departing plane. This isn't about right, I replied. It's about prepared. He exhaled slowly. I let pressure influence judgment. That happens. It shouldn't. No, I agreed, it shouldn't. He glanced at the stars on my collar, visible now, undeniable. I misjudged you, he said. You misjudged the process, I corrected. He nodded once, accepting that distinction. Over the next 72 hours, I barely slept. Reports came in measured bursts. Initial insertion clean. Contact avoided first night. Movement confirmed in secondary corridor precisely where the updated intelligence had suggested. On the second evening, a message arrived that made my pulse slow deliberately. Unplanned vehicle convoy detected near primary objective. Had Bryce's team gone under the original parameters, they would have entered that corridor at dawn. Under revised strategy, Ramirez's unit rerouted before sunrise, avoiding the convoy entirely. A small change on paper. A lifetime preserved in reality. At 0300 hours on the third night, my secure line rang. Objective secured, Ramirez said. Minimal resistance, no casualties. I closed my eyes for one measured breath. Extraction. En route. Bring them home. When the aircraft touched down 2 days later, the welcome was subdued as always. No banners, no applause, just handshakes and quiet relief. Bryce stood beside me as the team disembarked. He watched Collins remove his helmet, Harris stretch his back, Ramirez exchange a look with me that said more than words. You saw the convoy report, I said quietly. Yes, ma'am. If your team had deployed under the original plan. He didn't answer immediately. We would have been inside that corridor, he said finally. Yes. He swallowed. I didn't see it, he admitted. You didn't have the experience to. He nodded. And that's not a condemnation, I added, it's a starting point. Commander Blake joined us. Formal review board will convene next week, he said. Standard procedure. Standard. That word carries comfort for those over 60. It means order, structure, accountability. The board would examine the intel discrepancy, the reassignment decision, the endorsement delay, not to assign humiliation, but to reinforce process. Later that afternoon, Bryce knocked on my office door. Admiral? Come in. He stood at attention for a moment, then relaxed. I've submitted a written acknowledgement to the review board, he said, regarding my initial acceptance of reassignment without verifying mission-specific readiness. That's appropriate. I also requested extended field certification before future deployment consideration. I studied him for a long second. Why, I asked. Because I don't want to rely on someone else's name again. That was the first time he had said it plainly. I leaned back slightly. Leadership, I said, isn't inherited, it's accumulated. He nodded. My father won't be pleased. That's between you and him. He gave a faint, rueful smile. When he left, I looked down at the endorsement folder again. The signature I had placed there days earlier had not been dramatic. It had not been accompanied by raised voices or public correction. It had simply been deliberate. For those who have lived long enough to see systems falter and recover, who have watched careers rise and fall, the lesson is rarely about vengeance. It is about responsibility exercised at the right moment. Blake hadn't seen the stars. Bryce hadn't understood the weight. But both had begun to learn. And that sometimes is the real correction. The formal review board convened the following Tuesday. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no courtroom theatrics, Just a long oak table in a secure conference room, flags positioned carefully behind seated officers, legal counsel present to document proceedings. The kind of setting many Americans over 60 recognize from civic hearings and military inquiries: orderly, deliberate, procedural. Commander Blake sat to my right. Lieutenant Commander Bryce sat 2 chairs down, uniform, immaculate expression, composed but reflective. Across from us, 3 senior officers, 1 from Naval Intelligence, 1 from Joint Operations, and 1 civilian oversight representative appointed by the Department of Defense. The chair of the board, Vice Admiral Grant, opened the session calmly. This review concerns the reassignment and subsequent delay of Operation Viper 7. Our objective is clarity and procedural reinforcement, not punishment. That word reinforcement matters. Grant turned first to Blake. Commander, what prompted the initial reassignment? Blake did not deflect. External pressure, he said. Recommendations from Washington suggesting strategic advantage in placing Lieutenant Commander Bryce in visible command. Did you independently verify mission-specific readiness? Grant asked. No, sir. A quiet acknowledgement. Grant then turned to Bryce. Lieutenant Commander, were you aware of the updated intelligence variants at the time you accepted reassignment? No, sir. Did you request a detailed field readiness comparison before assuming responsibility? No, sir. Grant nodded once, then shifted his gaze to me. Admiral Morgan, you placed a hold on the mission endorsement. Why? I answered plainly. Because the intelligence shift altered the operational risk threshold. Under revised data, deploying an unprepared team would have constituted preventable exposure. Grant studied me for a long second. Were you aware that your decision would create friction within the command? Yes, sir. And you proceeded anyway? Yes, sir. Silence settled across the room, not tense but weighty. The civilian oversight member leaned forward slightly. Admiral, had the mission proceeded under original assignment, what is your professional assessment of potential outcome? I did not dramatize. High probability of engagement within an undermapped corridor, elevated casualty risk. How elevated? I held his gaze. Unacceptably. No one in that room required embellishment to understand what that meant. The board recessed for 30 minutes. When they returned, Vice Admiral Grant summarized the findings. Intelligence oversight required strengthened cross-verification protocols. Command reassignment decisions must include mission-specific readiness validation. Oversight endorsement authority acted within scope and prevented potential operational compromise. No reprimands, no public rebukes. Just correction. Afterward, as officers filtered out quietly, Blake remained seated for a moment. I allowed politics to cloud judgment, he said softly. Yes, I replied. I won't again. I believe you. He looked at Bryce. Learn from this, he said. Bryce nodded. Later that afternoon, Bryce approached me in the hallway. My father called, he said. And he was disappointed. I waited. I told him he was wrong to intervene. That surprised me, not because I doubted his integrity, but because breaking from expectation is rarely easy. How did he respond? I asked. He reminded me that reputation opens doors. And what did you tell him? That reputation without competence closes them. I allowed myself the smallest hint of a smile. That's progress. He hesitated. I owe you thanks, he said. You owe your team preparation. Yes, ma'am. The cost of the mistake had not been public humiliation. It had been humility. That cost for a young officer with a powerful last name is not insignificant. That evening I drove to Dayton. I hadn't planned to, but the review board had stirred something reflective in me. My father was 78 now. His hands trembled slightly when he held a coffee mug, but his mind remained steady. He was sitting at the kitchen table when I arrived, newspaper folded neatly beside him. Evie, he said, smiling. I poured us both coffee. How's the Navy? He asked. Busy. Complicated? Sometimes. He studied me over the rim of his mug. You look tired. Long week? He nodded as if that explained everything. I didn't tell him about intelligence discrepancies or review boards. He didn't need the details. I had to make a decision, I said instead. It upset some people. Did it keep folks safe? Yes. Then you made the right one. Simple. He reached for the old wrench on the counter, the one he still kept despite retirement. You remember what this taught you? He asked. Leverage, I said. And responsibility? He nodded. Anybody can push, he said. But when you've got weight behind you, you better know where it lands. That night, driving back toward Virginia, I thought about the cost of leadership. It isn't applause. It isn't rank. It isn't even vindication. It is the willingness to absorb friction so others don't absorb harm. Blake had paid with pride. Bryce had paid with illusion. I had paid with sleep and scrutiny. And my team? They had paid with preparation, the kind that kept them alive. That is the true cost. And it is always worth it. The change didn't happen overnight. Institutions don't pivot dramatically because of a single review board. They adjust in increments, policies, clarified memos, rewritten briefings conducted with slightly more attention to detail. For most people inside the building, Viper 7 became just another case study in procedural refinement. For those of us involved, it marked something more personal. A week after the review, Commander Blake requested a closed-door meeting with department heads and senior officers. It wasn't mandatory, but attendance was strongly encouraged. I arrived in full-dress uniform. Not for ceremony. For clarity. When I entered the conference room, conversation softened slightly. The gold trim, the ribbons, the 4 silver stars on my collar, visible now without ambiguity, carried their own language. Blake stood at the head of the table. "Thank you for coming," he began. "This session is about process integrity and command responsibility." He paused, then gestured toward me. "I also want to formally acknowledge Admiral Morgan's oversight authority and the role it played in preventing potential operational compromise." There was no applause. Military rooms rarely offer that. There were nods. Measured respect. Blake continued. "In future reassignment decisions, mission-specific readiness verification will be mandatory prior to submission for endorsement. No exceptions." That was the correction. When the meeting adjourned, a few officers approached me quietly. One captain in his late 50s, hair silver at the temples, extended his hand. "Admiral," he said, "my son deployed twice under assumptions that turned out incomplete. I appreciate what you did." I held his handshake firmly. "We all carry those memories," I said. He nodded, understanding more than I needed to say. Later that afternoon, Bryce asked to speak with me again. We walked along the perimeter path outside the compound. The Atlantic wind was calmer now, sunlight reflecting off the water in soft glints. "I've been reassigned," he said. "To where?" "Advanced Field Certification Program, 6 months. That's appropriate." "It's not what my father envisioned. It's what you need." He stopped walking and faced me fully. "When you delayed Viper 7, he said, did you ever consider how it might affect your standing?" I considered the question honestly. "No." "Why?" "Because standing is temporary, consequences are permanent." He absorbed that. I didn't understand that before he admitted. "You're beginning to." He looked at the horizon. My father built his career in a different era. Advancement meant visibility. Strength meant decisiveness. And now I asked. Now it seems strength also means restraint. That's a lesson many don't learn until it costs them more. He extended his hand. "Thank you, Admiral." I shook it. "Earn it," I said. He smiled faintly. "I intend to." As he walked away, I felt something settle. Not triumph, resolution. In the weeks that followed, Ramirez's team resumed training cycles. Routine returned. The quiet rhythm of preparation, evaluation, recalibration. One evening, Ramirez lingered after a planning session. "Ma'am," he said, "word's gotten around." About you?" I raised an eyebrow slightly. "About what you did." I leaned back in my chair. "Ramirez," I said evenly, "what matters is what we did." He hesitated. "With respect, ma'am, it matters that someone at your level chose to use it." "Use what?" "The weight." I thought of my father's wrench. "The weight isn't for display," I said. "It's for balance." He nodded slowly. "You know, he added a lot of us. We've seen leaders chase headlines. This was different." "That's because it wasn't about headlines." He gave a small, satisfied nod and left. That night, alone in my office, I removed my cover and set it gently on the desk. The silver stars caught the overhead light briefly before dimming as I turned off the lamp. He didn't see the stars. Not because they weren't there, but because he was looking at connections instead of competence. Blake had looked at optics instead of readiness. Bryce had looked at opportunity instead of preparation. Each of them had learned. And so had I. Authority isn't proven in confrontation. It's proven in restraint. For Americans who have lived long enough to see institutions tested, who remember Watergate hearings, Vietnam briefings, corporate collapses, and quiet corrections, trust isn't restored through speeches. It's restored through steady action. The stars on my collar are small pieces of metal. They shine when light hits them. But their real meaning isn't in the shine. It's in the shadow they cast the space they occupy when difficult decisions must be made. And sometimes the most powerful moment isn't when someone sees them. It's when they finally understand what they mean. Spring came quietly to Virginia Beach. The cold edge left the wind. Dogwoods bloomed along the sidewalks outside the base. Retirees set up folding chairs near the shoreline again, watching the waves roll in as if they'd never stopped. Inside the compound, life resumed its steady rhythm. Training rotations, equipment audits, briefings that started on time and ended with fewer assumptions than before. Viper 7 became part of the institutional memory, not a scandal, not a triumph, a lesson. 3 months after the deployment, Commander Blake stopped by my office without an appointment. He didn't sit immediately. He stood near the bookshelf where my father's old wrench rested inside its wooden box. "I submitted my transfer request," he said. "Voluntary?" I asked. "Yes." "To where?" "Training Command, Leadership Development." That surprised me, though perhaps it shouldn't have. "You don't see that as a demotion?" I asked. He shook his head. "I see it as correction." He looked at the wrench. "Your father's—" "Yes. My grandfather worked steel in Pittsburgh," he said. "Used to tell me the same thing you said in that review board. Preparation over pride." He was right. Blake nodded slowly. "I won't make that mistake again," he said. "I believe you won't." He hesitated a moment longer. "Thank you," he added. "For what?" "For letting it be a lesson." After he left, I sat quietly for several minutes. Revenge, as people imagine it, is loud. It's confrontation, exposure, humiliation. But that isn't what happened here. No one was destroyed. No careers ended. No reputations publicly dismantled. Instead, something quieter occurred. Responsibility corrected ambition. Process corrected pressure. Experience corrected assumption. Bryce wrote to me from his certification program in California a few weeks later. Not an official memo, a personal letter. He described long field exercises, night navigation drills, cold Pacific surf entries that left him coughing salt water and reconsidering every shortcut he had once been tempted to take. At the bottom he wrote, "I'm beginning to understand the difference between being assigned authority and earning it." That sentence mattered more than any apology. Ramirez's team continued to train and deploy with the same unremarkable excellence they always had. Collins retired that summer and sent me a photo of himself holding his granddaughter at a Little League game. No headlines, he wrote in the caption, just home. That is the real measure. One Sunday afternoon, I drove back to Dayton again. My father was in the backyard adjusting a small bird feeder he insisted needed better balance. "You fix things that aren't broken," I teased. He grinned. "Preventative maintenance," he said. We sat on the porch afterward, the sound of cicadas steady in the background. "You ever regret not pushing harder?" I asked him. "For what?" "For promotions, recognition." He shrugged. "I built what I needed," he said, "raised you, kept food on the table, slept at night." He looked at me then. "You?" I considered the question carefully. "No," I said. Because the truth is this. Leadership isn't about being seen. It's about seeing clearly when others don't. It's about standing steady when pressure suggests bending. It's about knowing when to act, and when restraint will carry more weight than confrontation. Commander Blake didn't see the stars. Lieutenant Commander Bryce didn't understand their weight. But in the end, both of them learned to look beyond shine and into substance. And that's the kind of correction that lasts. If you've lived long enough, you know this already. You've seen bosses rise too fast. You've watched institutions wobble under pride. You've learned that quiet competence outlasts loud ambition. Maybe you've even stood in a room once where someone underestimated you. If this story reminded you of that moment of the times you chose steadiness over spectacle, I hope you'll carry it with you. And if you believe that earned authority still matters, that preparation still counts, that responsibility should outweigh connections, then share this story with someone who needs that reminder. Because sometimes the most powerful stars are the ones you don't have to show.